One of the most important user bases on this channel are recent graduates. So in this video I thought I'd provide you with some interesting insight into what are some tips and tricks on how to prepare and what to avoid, more interestingly, when applying for a well-paid job. And I'm talking specifically here about the sequence of events after you got your resume screened and you're called in for a phone interview, or ideally for the on-site interview. The first thing that I want to touch upon here is probably also the most important of all. That is to not underestimate the time it takes to properly prepare for either a phone interview or an on-site interview. And my experience shows that this is actually somewhere around 2 weeks preparation time. And of course this might vary. I mean, if you believe that your technical abilities are not the main highlight and you have to prepare on those, probably programmers would have to prepare for a little bit more time for this. But usually I found that 2 weeks is the time it took. People that I know got hired into some pretty well-paid jobs and into the jobs that are actually having a high potential for to further their careers. The second piece of advice here is to prepare what matters. Which, to give an example, if you're good at the technical stuff, if you really know your thing, then probably you shouldn't invest those 2 weeks into further preparing the technical stuff, because these days there's a lot of emphasis on behavioral and hypothetical questions during an interview. So if you're someone that's technically skilled, you should probably spend the bulk of your time on prepared for the behavioral part. That is, tell me about the time when you failed, and these types of questions. Now, there's also in reverse to this. If you're someone that's really good at building relationships and at speaking to other people, you probably don't have problems in getting to answer these behavioral questions, but probably your weakness will be more on the technical side of things. So you should probably emphasize more on, you should spend more time and more brain cycles on preparing for those core aptitudes required to get the job done for your specific roles. The third very common misconception here is the language skills. So many people believe that in order to be a successful candidate at a high-performing company, you have to have perfect language skills. When in fact, my experience showed this cannot be further from the truth. I know people who got hired that I could barely understand. I could only understand 50 or 55% of what they said, and they got hired and they are successful in their jobs. The main thing here is to be able to communicate the idea that you want to transmit, besides the fact that your answer should be strong and you should have an answer for these questions. But you'll be surprised how challenging it is actually to come up with proper answers, properly communicated, especially for the behavioral part of this interview. So actually I would even argue that lack of language skills could actually play to your advantage if you're making your communication more concise. You're trying to really choose your words wisely. I would like to argue with you that you're in a much better spot than when compared to someone that has perfect language speaking skills, from which the expectation would be that they'd be giving rather perfect answers, if there's any such thing. The fourth point that I want to touch upon here is that people easily get, especially recent graduates, get demotivated after failing once for a job interview. And of course, this is quite a challenging thing, and it plays with your morale. But at least in the US, there's a saying that it takes at least 3 times to get into a FAANG company. So what else could you do here is to simply apply for multiple roles at the same time, even for the same company, if they allow this, of course. But many companies do. So don't get discouraged about these things. And the fifth point I want to touch upon here might be slightly related, but you should take it as a separate one, and probably one of the most important pieces of advice that you'll hear in this video. Do not underestimate the power of confidence. It's usually the most confident people that get into the best jobs. How do you show confidence? Well, it's something that you must train yourself to show. And of course, the best prepared people tend to be the most confident ones. But it's been proven over and over and over again that confidence is the main predictor of high-performing individuals. So whatever you do, try to gain confidence in the process, because truth be said, during that interview is between you and the interviewer. So you want to convince them, and more often than not, they want to hire you if you're the right person for the job. So also now, on the other extreme here, do not confuse confidence with confirmation bias. In other words, there are some people, not many people, who are really confident while giving a terrible answer. So you should prepare. I mean, if you're giving a terrible answer for tell me about the time when you failed, you could say it with confidence, but they will spot you and that won't work out. So try to reach that level of confidence where you have a good mix of preparation and confidence rather than just confidence. All right, but still, trust me when I tell you that confidence goes a long way, especially for recent graduates. Number 6, especially in our digital age and with these YouTube things, many people tend to spend the bulk of their time navigating on the internet and trying to accumulate as much information as possible. This is a terrible technique, at least on its entirety. Why it's a terrible technique? Because you cannot focus on what it really matters. That is to focus on yourself, your own skills, to really become a better version of yourself. And as someone once said, the journey inside is a lot more interesting and broader than the journey outside. So avoid trying to using the internet as a time sink. Just use the internet as an accelerator to become a better version of yourself. This is the correct way to use the digital context. Number 7 is again a very important advice on properly understanding where you come from. In my opinion, you should be super thankful for the opportunity that you're provided with, because to tell you a little story from when I started working with HR, I was actually managing an HR software. It was for the pest control industry in the US. And I was seeing what more or less 200 hiring manager, which in fact most of them are small business owners, how they run their day-to-day screening, their day-to-day hiring activities. Day-to-day would be a wild overstatement, because they used to log in maybe once a month in the software, and probably 80 to 90% of the candidates coming into the software would never get screened, because what would happen, they would actually have a budget of, let's say, $1,000 to spend each month for HR, and that $1,000 budget would be spent on ads. Then those candidates would come into the software, and by the time they would come into the software, they would probably get a referral from someone internally at their company, so they couldn't care less about whomever was in the software. Now, luckily for most of you, this won't be the case, because these companies are actually have their goal to go through each and every resume that they receive in. So to come again to my initial point, you should be thankful for this opportunity, because in many cases, for many other types of roles, no one would ever bother to read your CV as they would in these cases. In these cases, there's people trained just to read CVs, to read your CVs. Of course, there's software also involved and so on and so forth, but you are being so much better treated when applying for a high-performing company as compared to, the pest control industry, for example. Number 8. When talking, yes, this is a general trend that's common to recent graduates and people coming from consulting businesses. The Deloittes, the Accentures, and all that stuff. People tend to give answers when they from projects that they handle themselves, all by themselves. When in fact, when you're applying for a high-performing company, more likely you're going to apply for a team within a team. So you're applying in a context of very distributed context in which team players are the best performers. And so during the interview, one of the main objectives of your interviewer is to screen you of how well will you be performing in the context of a team. Or the definition of behavioral interviewing, and pretty much also the other types of interviewing, is that they look at your past behaviors to predict your future performance. Or if you only talk about projects you've done by yourself, that will not be a great indicator of a team player. So whenever you can, try to go with an example of a time when you work in a team context, because that will be the best predictor and will score you much more points going to an interview. Number 9, you see, I previously said that you shouldn't use the internet as a time sink, but there are some lists which I also published, and will publish a few more of them, with the most commonly asked questions in job interviews, because these interviewing techniques are pretty much the same for the past 20 years or so. So it does actually make sense to go through the most commonly asked questions, if not to confirm your knowledge, to also, gain some confidence in your answers. So I have, for example, a list with the 35 most commonly asked questions, which I will link in the video description. And the main reason being that you'll be surprised how small things can make a big difference in your answers. And more often than not, it's only a matter of practice that will make your answer average to a great one. So I'd very much encourage you to go through these lists of questions that I published, and there are also other lists on the internet, because they will help you to so much better improve your chances of coming up with great answers in pretty much any scenario. And finally, and I left this one all at the end, is one of the most efficient methods to prepare for a job interview that I know is to role play. And this role play, it also touches upon the technical part. So you cannot really precisely do role play here. Even I would argue you could, even in the case of programming assignments, I would argue you could. But if you have someone else, someone to reference, to speak to, someone to tell you, hey, you're doing well, you're doing not that well, that will play a huge difference in how you grow throughout the process. And by the way, when I'm saying to someone to role play with, I'm not saying, hire me for 1 hour. That won't make any difference in a preparation for 2 weeks. I'm talking about finding someone to be there with you for 2 weeks. Every single day, ideally, to listen to you and to assess your development. A coach, if you want. These are incredible accelerators to your success. It's just that many people cannot really find this, or they underestimate the power of communication and of conversation while preparing for something, because anything is basically a skill that you can train for, and the best way to train for it by comparing yourself, and by getting your performance measured by someone else throughout the process. So the best people the people that I know that got into very good jobs and reported high levels of success all spent weeks on preparing, on role playing, on taking these things super seriously, or making these in a distributed context as much as possible. So these would be the main pieces of advice, and some common pitfalls that I would very much advise you to avoid. But overall, I believe there's never been a better time for recent graduates to get into well-paid jobs, and jobs that offer a lot of potential. So I would very much encourage you to keep that in mind while applying for any role. So this being said, I hope you found this information useful, and thank you very much for watching.